Okay, we will continue on. We're talking about John Milton and Paradise Lost and Paradise Refound. Well, Paradise Found was never completed because he died. But he ended up in prison and he was blind. And then his daughter came and he would speak the words to her and she copied them. You see, this is another great epic work being done, an allegory it's called, in a prison again. At the same time as John Milton, this brilliant, intelligent man, we have a man named John Bunyan. And he was probably the least educated great author. He couldn't read or write until he became an adult. Actually, until he married. And he was rough. His father was a tinker, and that meant his father went around and sold little like metal items to people, and he would work in metal, and so he wasn't educated, but he had a beautiful mother named Mary and a sister named Mary, and they loved him and they loved the Lord. The mother was very sickly, but she loved John and she would pray and pray, and they felt so bad because he was in this rough world with the father, and he started swearing, and he could not talk without profanity coming out of his mouth. It was so bad that he became known in the town as this swearing young man, and people would literally cross the other side of the street when they saw him coming. Well, there was another Mary, and she was a girl who really liked John Bunyan, and she saw potential. So between his mother's prayers, and then his mother died, and he felt so bad. Then his sister Mary kept praying and kept helping him. Well, finally, you could read his biography, it's fascinating. He became a Christian. And what do you think happened to him? He could not stop preaching. God, when he was saved and gave his life to God, to Christ, the swearing went, but he still was a very verbal, emotional person, and he was so excited about finding the Lord, he couldn't stop preaching. Well, it was against the law to preach at that time because you had a real battle going on. And that's what's called, you've heard of the war, the Civil War in England. It was going on. Oliver Cromwell was the leader of the Protestant Puritans. They were called the Roundheads because they all cut their hair like a bowl on the head with round. And then they were fighting the King's men. Well, because the King's men, King Charles was very corrupt, and he was not giving 1 inch for religious freedom, and the people were poor, and he was, it was just really a very bad situation. And even the aristocratic people that would usually have been loyal to the crown, they jumped on Oliver Cromwell's side. And so Oliver Cromwell was this brilliant genius of a, commander of an army. And do you know, the last time I was in England, I got to visit Nottingham Castle, which they say is Robin Hood's castle. And no one knows for sure because Robin Hood is from so long ago, Middle Ages. But when you go to a place like England, there's always layers. There's so many layers under because it's been going since, the time of Christ. So in the basement of the Nottingham Castle is a museum, and it's a war memorial. Come to find out, Oliver Cromwell's famous letter, his declaration of war, is in that museum, and I saw it. And do you know why it's there? Because the war started right there in Nottingham. Isn't that incredible? Well, when John Bunyan was a young boy, he was at first for the King's men. He didn't know the difference. And then he saw what some of the King's men did and how cruel they were. And they would literally cut off heads and put them on stakes around the area. And it was brutal. It was a brutal war. And so then John Bunyan decided, I think I'm going to be on the side of the Roundheads. And this was even before he had become a Christian. But it was a very serious war and a lot of bloodshed. Well, finally, the war was won by Oliver Cromwell. They deposed the king. They had to chop off his head because he would have never given up the throne, sadly. So then Oliver Cromwell became the Lord Protector, or the Prime Minister, and his secretary actually was John Milton, you know. Now, I'm covering a lot of ground here. For you young people, there are so many good books on this, and there are movies. There's a movie on Oliver Cromwell, and there's many books on John Bunyan. And what I'm trying to get to is John Bunyan then, because he wants to, I'm fast forwarding, because he's preaching, and Oliver Cromwell has not taken the position yet. It's not free to preach in England. You can't preach on the street. And he couldn't keep his mouth closed, so he goes to jail. And he has these dramatic dreams and visions. He's a very, very big personality person. And guess what he writes? He writes the most famous book of all, called Pilgrim's Progress. Of all the books next to the Bible, it's sold more. It's been translated into more languages. It's always on the bestseller list. It's incredible. So here you have this poorest man that couldn't read or write, had to be taught to read by his sister and his wife, that then he had, and then he goes to jail because he's preaching. He writes this great book. At the same time, John Milton writes this great book. And that's why I said in this paper here, this is my writing that I was reading, and I sent it to you as a handout. It is said that there was more literature written at this period in history, because you had 100 years, people literate, they all are excited and like delivered and set free, and there's hundreds of writers. They're called the great Puritan divines, and you have this literature just pouring out of England. And so in all of history, there was more in this 40-year period than in all periods before or since. It's incredible. And you know, I read a statistic that 80% of all the world's great literature comes from England. And that's from this Bible being delivered into the hands of the people. Remember? Came through Wycliffe, and then Tyndale, and then it came, Martin Luther did it for the continent. But in England, Tyndale, translated, and then Cloverdale. Then Tyndale died, but they saved his Bible, and it went back and became the King James Bible. And then the Geneva Bible, the reason that was translated in Geneva, that was English people also, working with the Continental Reform people from Calvin's group. But they had to flee and go over to Geneva, where it was safe to translate. Switzerland's always been a neutral country. So that's the story of that. But my mother, who actually would have been in high school, probably in the 1930s, I have her book, and I couldn't put my hand on it today, but it was her literature book. And that's where I learned a lot of this from. It was a very interesting English high school literature book, would have been used in the Chicago schools in the 1930s. And it had this whole section on the Puritan time period of literature and how significant it was. And it is just cannot be stressed enough how it affected everyone, because then the people had these books with them. Also, Fox's Book of Martyrs, which was the Christian history book for the Christian people, because it went back to the time of Christ and went through all the martyrs and everyone suffering and the price that was paid for their faith. And it also had modern martyrs right up to the time he finished his book, which is in this era. Okay. And I say, what gave them, these pilgrims, the vision for such an undertaking? It's God's Word. It's the Bible all over again. In science, we have Kepler, Newton, Galileo, Copernicus, and so many more. All Christian believers, all giving God the glory, making these incredible. And this is the new beginning in scientific method. Kepler in 1602 charted the orbital route of Mars, and he realized that it was not going around Mars, it was in an elliptical, like a long oval, being recognized through reason and experiment. In music, we have the beginning of the Baroque era, reflecting God's order and freedom in Christ. I talked about that. Remember Bach? He really shows this in like Jesu Joy. The left hand is, that bass is driving, but it's in order and it's keeping the beat. And that's the left hand on the piano. And the right hand is singing and dancing and freedom in Christ in the framework of these orderly measures. That's why all good music teachers that my children have ever had and I've ever had, they always say, we cleanse ourselves with Bach, because Bach is so orderly. You can play the romantics and you can play all the beautiful other music, but you always come back and cleanse yourself with Bach. He brings you right back, this order and beauty. Yes. So we see here the emergence of the merchant class and the middle class. Society is its fruit. Through the study of the Bible, schools emerge across the whole continent. People are awakened from medieval ways of thinking, and the results are life-changing. Some of the breakdown of this bondage of feudalism came through the Crusades. Once these people went on these crusades and they got out of this little farm and they started seeing the city and they saw how other people lived, it opened their eyes. They thought, I can live that way too. That was a real important part, because they were trying to take back the Holy Land and Christian centers that had been taken by the Moors and the Muslims. The result was this broke the power of feudal life. They tasted freedom and a picture of a bigger world. There's a lot to be said for exposure. And that's why true education, I believe, in my life has been my travels. I feel like my travels, every place I've ever gone, has given me such insight, understanding, and exposure. I'm so grateful to God. And I believe that children and young people need to travel. They need to go to the great museums. They need to go to the great galleries. They need to go to the great sites, whatever they can see and experience. And that's why in a museum, artifacts are really important. A lot of the museums have now kind of put a lot of their artifacts away, and they just have one big room with a few things. I believe in a lot of artifacts. I think it really, really connects you to what went on in the past. And I remember being at a museum in Ireland, in Dublin, and they had all this Roman jewelry, because so many of the Romans had lived there. And it was just so eye-opening to me. It's like a light went on. Aha. And their jewelry is not that much different than our jewelry. It's quite amazing. Bracelets and rings and necklaces. And I just feel that whenever you can go to a good museum, and if you can't go now with travel being restricted, you can go online and you can visit a lot of museums online. There's a lot of things you can do. Well, I also believe that there's just so much that the 1600s also gave us in. We talked about the Pilgrims, Puritans, the settling of America. We also have the Puritan era, and then I will tell you what happened in England. During the civil war that went on for all these years, there was a meeting in Westminster in Parliament, and they took several years, about 4 years, and debated what was the catechism going to look like in the Church of England. Because remember, under Henry VIII, which was Elizabeth I's father, Protestantism came to England because he broke with the Catholic Church because of his, actually it was because of his divorce and his marriage to Queen Elizabeth's mother, who was Anne Boleyn, who later sadly lost her head. But the Protestantism had not really been hammered out, and the Anglican Church was trying to combine the presbytery from the Church of Scotland, which John Knox had had a big part in. Remember, he had gone over and studied under John Calvin and come back and established the Church of Scotland, which was the Reformed Presbyterian form of church government, which America, actually our government is based on that threefold. I talked about that last time. And so then they were trying to combine the good things from the Catholic Church with the Anglican Church and with the also the presbytery, and you had these other denominations, and you had Reformed. So this was a lot of hammering out, and it's called the Westminster Catechism, which is what came out of that. And I had always thought the Westminster Catechism was formed by, a church, but really it was formed by Parliament. Isn't that incredible? And I had a statement, I couldn't find it, but I'll try to paraphrase it, that they took all of the good from the Catholic form of, the worship service, the liturgy. They kept everything good from that they could. And then they had the Presbyterian form of government. So they rejected the papal. They had the representative form of government. You have bishops and you have elders, but the people are involved in the vote of that, you see. And that then they had the prayers and the liturgy from the Reformed and the Lutheran. So you have a really good combination, and it was agreed upon, voted upon. And so then after Oliver Cromwell took the position as Prime Minister, I guess Lord Protector of England, he ruled, and he was pretty strong in his Puritan beliefs and offended some people, but it is said for the times it was perhaps necessary. But then when he died, his son did not have the same power. This is so common. This happens all the time in history. So the people got tired of not having royals. So they restored, it's called the restoration of the monarchy came, and they restored the king back, the next in line. Well, he didn't like the fact that, this had even occurred. And so then it went back into the British monarchy, but it always retained from then on the Anglican Church was considered Protestant, and it was inclusive of all within the realm of Christendom. And so out of that, and that's just a real big summation because I don't have time to go into all of the details, but it was resolved, and later there's a lot about Cromwell. The king actually had his body exhumed and hung it in Parliament. You know, I tell you, these things go on and on. It's interesting, but I also wanted to talk about the fact that what you're having now, if we go over to the continent, I want to just cover a few things. In 1619, Ferdinand II becomes the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, that was what the British and the Christian and the Protestants were fighting against. They didn't want to be under a Holy Roman Emperor. So that was in Spain, okay? And then in 1618 to 1648, you had that 30 Years' War. I talked about that. That was, of course, happening in Europe. And then you had in 1648 the Peace of Westphalia. Switzerland and Netherlands recognized as independent of the Holy Roman Empire. So the continent is also fighting their battle. It's interesting, the same as England. 1661, Louis XIV establishes absolute monarchy in France. And you know, that didn't work out so well, because remember 100 years later, that's when you had the French Revolution. So people they were ready to be free to being totally dominated by a royal house. And that's why in England, it's the reason they retained their throne is it's considered a constitutional monarchy. And that means that the royal house at that point was executive, and then later in this century it really changed. You have a prime minister, and the royal house is really more of a figurehead. But in those days you had parliament, and you had the law courts. So you had the three again: judicial, executive, legislative, and that's what America has. So I would give you a few more. 1603 to 1714, the Stuarts rule England. 1688, the Glorious Revolution in England establishes government by consent. That's what I just said. 1688 to 1702, William III and Mary II reign over England. William is called William of Orange, and he came from Holland. He was related to the royal family. He was a good king, and his wife Mary. Mary was actually the daughter of James, who was a Catholic, but she became Protestant. She was a good queen. And William and Mary are very honored and respected by all. In our country, we have the famous William and Mary College, which was established when we were in the colonial period of America. I already said 18, that 30 Years' War began. 1648, that's on the continent. The Peace of Westphalia ends the 30 Years' War, and the Habsburgs were defeated. So the Peace of Westphalia is a really big one, and that was, of course, in Germany. 1648, Swiss independence is acknowledged by the Holy Roman Empire. 1661, Louis XIV established absolute monarchy. 1640, a nationalist revolution reestablishes Portugal as an independent country. And 1648, Spain finally recognized Holland's independence. So this is just the big picture of the events that were going on in Europe. But I would say the real fruit and flower on this church history tree that we are working with is the fact that these countries were getting free from the dominion of the Pope and monarchies that were holding them down. And it was freedom. And America was the biggest picture of all. because you had people going to a country, and how were they ruled? Self-government. This had never happened before. It's directly from the Protestant Reformation. Well, I hope this helps you understand the 1600s. I will be back next time with the 1700s, and it will be another continuation. I sent you a lot of notes on Bach because he's so important. He's so big, and I think he represents everything good on the tree of church history. That almost rhymes. On the tree of his tree. There it is. God bless you all. I really hope you understood this. If not, read your notes and study on your own. Take what you can and keep moving along. Remember, this is a big overview, and there are many other facets of 1600s that you may bump into and want to study. Please do. Well, God bless you, and I will look forward to seeing you next time.